to refresh. It seems it's working.
Oh, okay. And Adele, just to confirm, it's also being recorded, or will we start recording when it starts?
I'm gonna start recording when it starts.
Okay, so should I let everybody in, or?
It's working.
Shalini, yes.
Or do you want to do that, Namrata? I can't see anything because I'm spotlighting.
Okay. Yeah, I understand. Okay.
Okay, recording starts in 1, 2, 3.
I have to admit everybody. I just realized all of this is on the live stream. Perfect. All of our internal conversations.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just realized it's February 29th and the leap day. So it feels like a wonderful day to have this summit and to have all of you with us here. And I hope it will be an informative, insightful, and invigorating day of discussion and participation. And we're really very grateful to all of the people who've given their time to participate and to all of you who have come to be with us today. And I'm going to, without further ado, open the day with our privilege of having Elder Sheldon here with us. So if I could flip to the next slide. And so you'll see here the bio for Elder Sheldon, which I'm not intending to read in full, but I do want to tell you that it's my honor to welcome Elder Sheldon today. And Elder Sheldon joins us from a community, an Inuk community, and has family here in northern Quebec, and also has a loving non-Inuit family in Ontario. And I'd like to turn it over to Elder Sheldon to give us some opening remarks and really ground us and welcome us for the day.
Nakumi, thank you. Ulaku, good morning. Tungasugi, welcome to everyone. It's an honor for me to be here in this space. I come to you from the rural area of Guelph this morning. It's still very cold up north for my family in Nunavik, northern Quebec. So we're lucky we have a bit of springtime here in southwestern Ontario. If we could just put our hearts and our minds together. And Inuit, the word itself means all living people. So we are being Inuit together this morning. I'm looking forward for your good learning together in the way of Inuit Hayumayatukangi, what Inuit have always known to be true, Inuit values, Inuit beliefs, and in modern day, and how we can move forward as people in today's modern environment. So we have the belief of working in harmony, respecting all living things, working in consensus, building on skills, learning from each other, and moving forward in a way that we're all working together for the common good. And as all people, sharing our knowledge together, coming together in kindness and in harmony to face some of those challenges that we all face together, and finding that way to move forward. Especially for our young people who are our future and the generations that will carry forward not only for survival of people, our people, but also in the way to preserve culture, to preserve language, to preserve who we are. We all have a background. We all come from somewhere. We all have a culture. We all have language. We all have places of origin. And we share with each other our beautiful ways of being together. So I wish everyone very good learning together, very good understanding of each other, and to go in kindness and openness. And I wish everyone a good day together. Ali and Nate, good learning together, and Nakomi Marialuk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Elder Sheldon, for opening our day and giving us, so much insight and reflection into a way forward. And I agree with you. We all come with our languages, and that we will all work today and through today with kindness and compassion towards each other. And you may hear me getting a little ragey through the day as we talk about issues, but I'm sure that's a good anger. And so can I take us to our next slide, please? And next, we are going to have one of our incredible Color Poverty, Color Change Steering Committee members, Leonie Chatat, who is going to actually give you a background in our own Indigenous Solidarity Statement, which we will also leave on the screen for you as well.
Good morning, everybody. I am happy to be here from Toronto, and I also want to say that this morning is a very special because as we're celebrating the Black people contribution in Canada, Color of Poverty, Color of Change strive to understand, appreciate, and work towards helping fully realize the sovereignty, self-determination, self-governance of Indigenous people and the nation-to-nation relationship between those distinct people and settler society. We believe that any dialogue, allyship, solidarity, or common work with Indigenous people must be based on the absolute respect of Indigenous rights, title, knowledge, and leadership on the ancestral land, water, and territory, and that the respect and honoring must also apply to all treaty and to other relevant agreements. Further, at the minimum, this solidarity must also include a shared commitment to the understanding, adoption, and the implementation of the 440 recommendation of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, the 94 call to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, the 231 call for justice of the nation inquiry into missing and murdering Indigenous women and girls, as well as the full adoption in Canada of the Universal Declaration on the Right of Indigenous People on GRIP.
Thank you so much, Leonie.
Now I will go. La couleur, Color of Poverty, Color of Change s'efforce de comprendre, d'apprécier et de travailler pour soutenir la pleine réalisation de la souveraineté, de l'autodétermination et de l'autogouvernance des peuples autochtones et de la relation nation-to-nation entre ces peuples distincts et la société colonne. Nous croyons que tout dialogue, tout effort comme allié, toute solidarité et tout travail en commun avec les peuples autochtones doivent reposer sur le respect absolu des droits, titres, savoirs et le leadership autochtone sur leurs terres, eaux et territoires ancestraux. Et qu'un tel respect et une telle reconnaissance doit aussi s'appliquer à tous les autres traités et aux autres ententes pertinentes. En outre, comme minimum, cette solidarité doit également inclure l'engagement à comprendre, à adopter et à mettre en application les 440 appels à l'action de la Commission royale sur les peuples autochtones, les 94 appels à l'action de la Commission de la vérité et réconciliation du Canada, les 231 appels à la justice de l'enquête nationale sur les femmes et les filles autochtones disparues et assassinées, ainsi que la pleine adoption par le Canada de la Déclaration universelle sur les droits des peuples autochtones, connue sous sous le sigle anglais UNDRIP. Merci.
Merci, Leonie. Thank you so much. And so before we go any further, if I could flip to the next slide, I wanted to take you through a little bit of housekeeping. My kids saw this slide and they said, oh, even these people know how much you love to clean your house, which made me laugh and sad simultaneously. So right at the bottom of your screens in your Zoom thing, you'll see a button that says interpretation. And if you click that button, you'll see an ability to use the French simultaneous interpretation. You'll also see an ability in that interpretation button to turn on the watch under ASL American Sign Language or FSL French Sign Language. And so please feel free at any time to use the interpretation services. And if there are any issues, please put your issue into the chat and one of our colleagues will be able to support you. I also wanted to let you know that we have closed captioning and you can see that in your meeting controls tools bar as well. And you can click on that for the closed captioning option. And if anyone is having issues or challenges, which I frequently do, please reach out in the chat to our colleagues. And if I could flip you to the next slide. I think one of the things that's really challenging with a full day on Zoom is that it's hard, right? We've heard that online fatigue, that Zoom fatigue piece. So I want to encourage everybody to do what you need to do. If you need to take yourself off video, if you need to stand up and stretch, and if you need to take breaks, you come first. And so please make sure that you do what you want to do. We will ask you also to keep yourself muted during the sessions, and then there will be opportunities in certain parts of the day for active participation. And as you hear those, we will give you instructions on how to connect and do that active participation. Again, if there are any technical issues, just communicate directly into the chat box. And I will be reminding you many, many times that at the end of today, you'll be receiving an evaluation form. If we could please ask you to complete it, it really helps us to think about ways in which we can structure future sessions, ways in which we can improve, and we would really appreciate your feedback. And so can I flip to the next slide? And without any more delay, I'm going to take you to our opening keynote, which is a focus on employment equity. And if we can go to the next slide. Very briefly, I would like to welcome Professor Adele Blaquette to give us our opening keynote. I'm not going to go through this entire incredible bio, but most recently, Professor Blaquette chaired the Federal Employment Equity Act Review Task Force. And if you hadn't had a chance already, please do look at the recommendations. They were incredible. They were much needed, including advocating for equity categories for Black and 2S LGBTQI+ communities and workers. And I would like to welcome Professor Blaquette and thank her for being here with us. And I will turn it over to you to speak to us a little bit about employment equity. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Merci infiniment. Je suis très honorée par cette invitation. Je voudrais à nouveau remercier toute l'équipe formidable de Color of Poverty, Color of Change pour cette belle invitation au sommet. J'aimerais remercier Elder Townie Sheldon for her opening remarks and beautiful way of being with us. Je vous rejoins depuis le territoire traditionnel non cédé de la nation Ganagahaga de la Confédération Haudenosaunee. And to acknowledge the land is, I would argue, part of our commitment to transforming relationships which surrounds this day. I'm going to offer most of my remarks in English, and I'm happy to take any comments in French. I was honored to be entrusted with the responsibility for chairing the Federal Employment Equity Act Review Task Force, which I've also taken to be an invitation to invoke Nobel laureate Toni Morrison to dream a little before you think about the kind of workplaces and ultimately the kind of society, the kind of Canada, and the kind of world we want to live in. And I've sensed the urgency of this work even more so in this particularly challenging world moment. In Canada, the Employment Equity Act framework has been a symbolic cornerstone of how we have addressed equity, certainly in our workplaces, but in our societies more generally, in the world of work. Recall that the world of work is where most people spend most of their working lives. But I also say symbolically because, of course, as we know, federal legislation covers only slightly less than 8% of the entire Canadian labor force. And so my comments today, although focused on the federal legislation, are particularly important, I would suggest, when we are thinking about where we should be going in Ontario. For labor and human rights initiatives in federal and law and policy, they've tended nonetheless to have an outsized influence, and that influence has often been well beyond the actual coverage of the federal employment equity framework in and across Canada. In our report, which we submitted in April of last year and was released publicly in time for International Human Rights Day on December 11th, 2023, alongside, as Shalini mentioned, an announcement by the Federal Minister of Labor to recognize the need for two new employment equity categories. One for 2S LGBTQI+ communities, and the other for Black Canadians who had been part of the so-called visible minority category, a category that was universally, a title that was universally despised, I have to say, and that the federal government has indicated it will change to racialized populations. But a group of that was so invisibilized in that category that one could literally hire in the category, fill the employment equity requirements, and still underrepresent. And so I start there because one of the things that we did in our task force, a task force of 12 absolutely remarkable people for whom I have the deepest respect, was to zero in on the history, to make sure that we were at once respecting the lived experience and the expertise and the commitment that so many people, hundreds of people and groups and organizations like yourselves brought before the task force, and honoring the history of settler colonialism, of residential schools and its legacies in missing and murdered Indigenous peoples, in disposition, in cultural genocide, in intergenerational trauma, and calls to processes of truth as crucial to any engagement with reconciliation. The history of slavery as a global institution, and an institution that involved Canada, both in the enslavement of Indigenous peoples and people of African descent. The history of racial segregation in Canada and Canadian workplaces, a history that we had all too readily overlooked in this contemporary moment. How many people realize that we had Jim Crow segregation, certainly in the railway, in the delivery of services, and that our Supreme Court of Canada on the eve of World War II actually upheld racially segregated law in the Christie v. York decision. The history of the Chinese head tax, the history of the internment of Japanese Canadians during the Second World War, the history of the purge of 2S LGBTQI+ people in the federal public service, for which Canada has only recently apologized, the history of a purely medical model of disability that has ultimately reinforced a deficit model of disability, rather than a focus on the barriers and contexts that prevent people with disabilities and all historically marginalized groups who seek equality, substantive equality, from achieving it. Histories, in other words, that lead us to recognize that equity is deserved, as an incarnation of the principles of human dignity, substantive equality, and restorative justice. So certainly the announcement that acknowledged the manner in which this history has an impact today on our workplaces was crucial. And I would say came as a bit of a bomb right before the December end of year holidays. But make no mistake, and I really want to accentuate this today, those recommendations of our task force are the tip of the iceberg of the report. Right? Inclusion in a framework of employment equity that is not changed, that is not transformed, will not bring us to the place we need to be, that of actually achieving and sustaining employment equity in our workplaces. So the report deliberately covers a lot, and I think our entire task force felt a responsibility to really honor one, the legacy. I've already mentioned the segregation in Canadian workplaces. Well, for those of you who've read Cecil Foster's really magisterial book, you know that the Black workers from the 30s through, well, to present really, fought tooth and nail, not only for a human rights framework, although they were central to it, but also for measures that would transform our workplaces. The report chronicles the history that led to the pivotal report penned by then Judge, now retired Supreme Court of Canada Justice Rosalie Abella, and a report that established, in the wake of the recent adoption of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, a notion of substantive equality. And I keep referring to substantive equality, and I want to be extra clear. Employment equity, our notion of equity, is grounded in substantive equality. In fact, it is substantive equality. And so when, as I wrote in the report and has been repeated, I say diversity is a fact, diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. But in the Canadian context, we have something quite distinct, and that is that equity is the law. I mean, not only our employment equity legislation, I mean substantive equality. Okay. And so with that framing, we try to capture then the gulf between what communities came and said to us, including, heartbreakingly, community members who said, our careers are lost. We have faced the brunt of systemic racism, of ableism, of anti-Indigenous sentiment, even in the face of Indigenous identity fraud. We have faced homophobia, transphobia in the workplace. Despite that, we're before the task force because it is absolutely critical to us that we transform our workplaces for the next generation. And so it's on the basis of that starting point that we sought to honor the trust, really, that was put in our task force, and argued for and made recommendations to support a transformative framework. Basically, the transformative framework has 3 pillars. 1, implementation through barrier removal. 2, meaningful consultations. And 3, regulatory oversight. The barrier removal piece is absolutely crucial. And I want to underscore the extent to which we heard from those who came before us that employment equity had gotten reduced to a numbers crunching exercise that stopped seeing the real people in the workplaces and the discrimination they were facing, and that it was crucial to be able to focus not on a deficit model that assumes the problem is with the people and we're just giving preferences to people who are not meritorious. And so there was a real unpacking of that and a reminder that our focus needs to be on the workplace. What are the barriers to equity seeking and equity deserving groups in the workplace that prevent them from being fully represented in the context? We've made a lot of progress notionally anyhow in respect of disability, where the Accessible Canada Act and similar legislation in the Ontario context emphasizes removing barriers in the workplace context. And that framework is foundational to employment equity. And so an entire chapter 4, focuses on the entire employment life cycle and the kinds of barriers that can be put in place, that are in place in workplaces that prevent people from being equitably represented in the workplace context. So that was the first dimension that needs to be really carefully rethought. The kinds of reporting that needs to be done needs to be rethought so that we're focusing on the barriers and, if I may, not focusing on the performative work of simply saying, well, we'll do a little EDI, we'll sprinkle some initiatives, do a little bit of training here and there, and, we're good. No, the focus is on actually removing barriers in the workplace so that you can actually achieve employment equity. Employment equity is not just a dream. Employment equity is something that's meant to be achieved and then sustained. So the second pillar is the pillar of meaningful consultations. And there's a long legal discussion around this because our basis is in Canadian constitutional law. But I think the groups that came before us captured the notion extremely well with the rally cry, nothing about us without us. Employment equity cannot be a top-down managerial exercise. That can actually harden exclusions, harden discriminatory ways of being when one thinks that one is acting for us rather than with us. This is a sea change, and it affects so much of how equity is conducted, but also what equity is about. Because if we're not actually about the freedom, really, of the groups who are underrepresented, if we're not actually about creating spaces where people can bring their whole selves authentically to the workplace environment, then we're just playing at equity, not actually achieving it. So that was really important. And our practical, of course, very specific recommendation is for employment equity committees to be put in place. The third and final element of the pillar is regulatory oversight. And the chapter is really detailed. We were stunned by some of what we saw. In particular, I realized to my shock that I might have been one of the only people outside of the very small and dedicated team doing audits of workplaces to have actually seen the audits and realized that the Human Rights Commission and the Labor Program weren't sharing these audits, even though one's responsible for implementation, one's responsible for auditing. So there were some really fundamental challenges, and we took very seriously the decision from May 2023 that the Commission itself was discriminating against employees. And so not only recommended an employment equity commission, but also rather an employment equity commissioner, but recommended that that commissioner not be housed in the Human Rights Commission, but rather in an office of equity commissioners that would comprise the pay equity commissioner and the accessibility commissioner, and that office would be funded in a manner commensurate with the responsibilities. And we pulled out information from a range of very similar bodies federally, including the Auditor General's mandate, to think about what that would look like. So this is absolutely a crucial piece. So surrounding that framework then is the framework that I've referenced, substantive equality. What I want to underscore now in the few minutes that remain for me is what supports this. So, and it's two elements that I'd really like to stress. One is the importance of data justice. And the second is the critical need to think about the role of the international, right? The various levers, both for supporting our framework and, frankly, for supporting the kind of change that we need internal to Canada and beyond. So data justice. And there's an entire chapter, chapter 2, which looks at data collection. So what we kept hearing as a task force is, well, it would be nice, but we can't really collect particular kinds of information, or privacy laws are a problem here. And so there's a really close discussion of this. But we wanted to reestablish some first principles. One is that employment equity legislation needs to be thought of as human rights legislation and as having what we refer to as a quasi-constitutional status, right? It's not technical box checking. It's about how we ensure that substantive equality is part of our everyday workplace lives. And so that led us to then focus on what the purpose is of the data collection. And we emphasized the human rights purposes and drew very heavily on some of the really good work that's been taking place in British Columbia, giving a basis for human rights data collection on race, right? And the notion of the grandmother principle that's beautifully incarnated in the Human Rights Commissioner's report from BC, and then framed through the way that the legislation was put in place. That starting point, which captures the importance of community involvement throughout, and that emphasizes or recognizes that if data collection is not done in this kind of human rights, community-minded manner, it can do harm. right? It can do harm. Communities have suffered the harm, and respond in ways that reflect a level of distrust because of it. So putting the purpose first is crucial, and emphasizing then the data justice dimension keeps that community-centered focus alive. So that's the first dimension, and a number of quite concrete recommendations flow out of that. Last comments are on the international. Our first recommendation touches the purpose of employment equity and adds to the preambular clause that already exists in the Act a reference to respect of international human rights, and specifically mentions the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And throughout the report, there's a focus on international human rights mechanisms, the comments of international human rights bodies about Canada's employment equity laws and what we're doing and not doing to implement and what we should be doing, and the contributions of international law to our very understanding of substantive equality. We're living in very dangerous times within and beyond. And we should never assume an indeterminacy of or a directionality of our laws. When people invoke the really powerful metaphor used amongst others by the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., that the arc of the universe bends towards justice, they often miss the fact that it doesn't do it alone, right? It happens because we bend it, because we work in a deliberate, mindful way to ensure that that happens. Part of that deliberate, mindful work involves paying close attention, not only to what's happening in our specific workplace, or not only what's happening in our specific province or country, territory or country, nation or country, but internationally. The international corpus needs our attention. We need to be at once influencing its direction and ensuring that we're drawing upon it to strengthen our own. So I've mentioned that one of our first recommendation includes international law. Does too. And that last recommendation is that the International Labour Organization, the UN body that is dedicated to social justice in the world of work as the way of peace, that organization be required or be recommended to prepare a survey of employment equity measures around the world, a tool that would be crucial to thinking about where we go with employment equity legislation, how the Canadian example has influenced measures, places like South Africa, Northern Ireland, in India, and various other countries around the world that have adopted measures and learned from and shaped our own understanding of substantive equality, and also how we can draw inspiration from them. And so let me conclude then with that reminder that the work is indeterminate. that we need to keep working with resolve and determination, that the recommendations in the employment equity context are robust. There's, to be specific, 187 of them. So I've tried to give you a high level indication of what they cover. But the goal here is really quite simple. It's not theoretical. Substantive equality is lived. It manifests itself tangibly and unassumingly, like when you walk into a room, even a virtual room like this one, and sense what it should be every time you walk into a room in a workplace and recognize that it's inhabited not just by the one, but the multiple intersecting communities and identities who know that we belong here. Thank you.
Professor Blackett, I'm pausing actually to sort of rest on your ending remarks. And we've had a lot of good discussion in the chat. And I think one thing that really reflects and stands out for me is how we use employment equity to be performative, and that we do have to, in your own words, be more deliberate and mindful, even in our own work as advocates, right? And we know the systems turn it performative. And there was a brilliant comment in the chat by Crystal. Most employers have just co-opted the language of equity without actually making workplaces safe, right? And I think that encapsulates for us what we feel, and the brilliance of tying the recommendations to a theme that we'll talk about later in the afternoon around the international sphere and how we look at the bigger picture. And so I think it's a wonderful way to start off the day. I have to tell you that it was a bright spot reading the report that came out of your task force. And I was just sort of pumping my fists and saying, go, go. So it, for all of us, I hope that energizes the people here today and beyond to really think about the ways in which this issue is critical and has been one that we have shied away from. And I do want to point out that one of the pieces Color of Poverty talks about, and you talked about it as well, is that most of the people we're talking about are not going to get the good benefit of the federal scheme. So we really have to think about how do we get to workers across this country, provinces, territories, communities at all levels to have this message heard. So I want to thank you so much for joining us this morning, and also for all your brilliant work that we are going to take away and use in our own advocacy. And thank you for the robust conversation in the chat. And now I'm going to move us along. And if I could get the screen back up, you're going to take you now to our next panel. And that panel is called Mobilizing for Racial Equity and Racial Justice. And if I can get the next screen up on the chat, I would like to introduce our incredible moderator, Larissa Crawford, of Métis and Jamaican descent. And she's an Indigenous anti-racism and climate justice researcher. I'm not going to read her entire bio, but I do have to say that for Color of Poverty, Color of Change, Larissa was instrumental in helping us to get out our 2019 fact sheets. And I was in awe of Larissa's work when she put all of those fact sheets together. And I just thought, who is this person and how are they doing this so magnificently? So I'm delighted that Larissa is here today with us. Larissa is going to take over at this point and also introduce you to, I believe, the panelists for this session. And I will hand it over without any more delay to Larissa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for opening the space in such a beautiful way. Tase, and I'm going to introduce myself now, and I'm going to do it in 3 languages, and this is to just signal to the interpreters. So first I'm going to introduce myself in Michif. Tase, Larissa Crawford Dishnik, Caution, Calgary Niwiken, Pi mi famille Penetinguishin, Pi Jamaica Niwikan, et maintenant français and in French. Bonjour, je m'appelle Larissa Crawford. J'ai une ascendance métisse de Penetanguishene et une ascendance afro-caribéenne de Jamaïque. Et ma famille francophone est du nord de l'Alberta. And now in English, hi, I'm Larissa Crawford. I carry Métis ancestry from Penetanguishene and Afro-Caribbean ancestry from Jamaica. And I pass this on to my 7-year-old daughter, Zyra, Z-Y-R-A. And I'm really excited to be here. Yeah, those color of change fact sheets, those were actually my first paid research contract. I've been doing Indigenous and anti-racism research for over 15 years. And I'm really excited about this panel because I've been working with these people's work for a very long time. It's a very inspiring group of people that we have today. And this touches very personally to me as well. I was very much pushed out of the workforce due to many of my disabilities, and not necessarily the disabilities, but how workspaces weren't able to accommodate and were resistant to accommodating. One of them being the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate. As much as we like to talk about making an equitable labor force, when it comes to the organizations that are doing that advocacy, we can fall into oftentimes the traps, the root causes of why we need to do this work in the first place. And so I was navigating workplaces that were using this equity work, that are doing this equity work, but in practice, in terms of how that work was being done, I was still experiencing a lot of racism. I was still experiencing a lot of ableism. And so recognizing that this whole conversation, this whole summit, we're discussing and we're talking about the labor market, and we really need to remain grounded in the reality that we're still working within the framework of capitalism, which was never set up to be equitable, which was never set up to be accessible. And so that's a really important acknowledgement to make before we kind of go into the summit, but especially this session. And so with that, I actually want to ask the other panelists to turn on their mic, their photos, their videos. And in that spirit, I would love for all of the panelists to just quickly introduce themselves by sharing this first, a response to this first question. How do you exist outside of your role as a laborer? And this is really important, just to acknowledge, like, we're more than our research, we're more than what we're doing. My disabilities inform my research, it informs my qualification to be here. My relationship to Earth informs my qualification to be here. And so I'd just like to open the space to allow the panelists to kind of share a bit more beyond their biographies. And so we'll have the biographies up. But again, if these speakers could go ahead and share really what brings them to this work, and how they exist outside of their roles as laborers. And I'll ask David to come up first. Maybe we'll go on to the next speaker before continuing. So Bryden.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Bryden King. So I'm a Anishinaabe from Wasauksing First Nation originally, and now I live up in the Sudbury area, Nuswagamuck. And I spend a lot of time outside because of where my house is, and I'm very grateful for that. Always reminding me of my connection to the land and who I am as Anishinaabe through that connection. Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Bryden. Yeah, we're so lucky to have you. I'll talk a bit more about your work and how much I admire your work when we come to your kind of section of the panel, but maybe we'll go to the next bio, please. Amazing, Chris.
Good morning. How y'all doing? Can you hear me or? Yes, all good. All right. So I'm Chris. I'm honored to be here. What do I do for fun? I try to tell really like wacky jokes, but nobody laughs at them, right? So that's number one. Number two is sleeping. Number 3 is really watching bad TV shows. And number 4, I guess, just trying to spend, I've got a little nephew in my life and I try to see him as much as I can. And trying to, be with people I care and love about. And I think that's the way to sustain yourselves. And I think you used a bad word earlier. You talked about the C word, capitalism. But in this world where we're trying to fight against capitalism, we need to be, I guess, holding and caring our communities and people we love. And that's it. Thank you.
Ooh, I love it. Yeah, I'm all about those bad words. That's what we're here for. Thank you, Chris. And of course, Sue Lynn, we could hear from you.
Awesome. Good morning, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. And of course, Larissa, very happy to be a panelist that you're moderating on. So thank you for that. I would say that the pandemic, I know that we all talk about the disadvantages and disparities, which is so important and fuels a lot of our work. I think one of the positive aspects that I want to talk about through that is a connection to my kids. We were obviously going through lockdown, and it's helped me rebalance my life in a way where, I'm focused on being present. There's so much work, of course, is unending work that we continue to do in this space. But at the same time, paying attention to, what my kids are going through, what they're seeing, how they're seeing the world, and really just being present and supporting them in a different way where I'm really finding balance in that, which is so important because this work can burn you out. That and avid traveling. So that is definitely a huge hobby of mine. And so again, happy to be here.
Thank you so much. And yeah, the children, and thank you for highlighting that too, like that gift of being able to reconnect with children and all the knowledge that we really get from that is a really beautiful way to open us. And I see that David has joined again. David, how's your tech looking? Let's see if we're connected. Maybe as the tech team is figuring out David's situation, we do have David actually up first to speak. And so I was kind of hoping, let's see, I'm not seeing any activity in the chat. Of course, this is how it often happens. And what I can do is actually, maybe in lieu of starting with David, let's actually, Chris, how are you feeling? Do you mind if, I know we kind of had you scheduled at the end. Maybe we can have you open up because I actually really, I'm very inspired by what you do, particularly in the context of Black History Month. This conversation is happening in Black History Month, and in reviewing and researching your work, especially, you do an amazing job at bridging the past with the living legacies that we're experiencing today and how that's informing our programs, how that's informing our labor market. And so for everyone's kind of reference, I have actually dropped the opening plenary summary into the chat, and you'll see a link to the plain text version as well. So these are essentially my moderating notes. And just as an accessibility practice, because we're going to be talking a lot about very specific kind of programs and data, I wanted to provide a way to easily access the links and resources that we're referencing, and to see the questions that we'll be asking them, the panelists. And so you can follow along in the document. And if you are following along, we're actually going to jump to the bottom of the page to Chris's contributions. So Chris, again, I really want to speak to your activism and research in examining the role of resistance by migrant farm workers in Canada. And you wrote this incredible article, What I See Today in Canada is the exact system of plantation labor that has ravaged the Caribbean. And as someone who carries a slave master name, again, this article really resonated with me. I'm often thinking about how what happened on these plantations have directly informed, again, our realities today. So a question that I have, particularly with regards to the program that you reference in this article, Seasonal Agricultural Worker Program, so SOP. You have this line, the SOP is eerily reminiscent to me. After the end of slavery, my mother's family immigrated to the Caribbean from India as indentured laborers. And then you go on to illustrate again how we're seeing this program cause an extension of that harm. And so how does looking to the past inform your understanding of this program? And if you could just provide a bit more background into what you're seeing.
Thank you. A massive love for that question. So, for anybody, and I'm sure a lot of you heard me rant before, right? I'm a kind of an old head in this stuff, and I always hope to be controversial and to push boundaries. That's what I do. I'm going to hopefully make you feel uncomfortable. And maybe the way for us to look at this is that this is not the past, right? This is a living, organic moment at the present. Right? The plantation economy, the system of indentured labor is what the foundation of our liberal democracy here in Canada is built on. There's no way to get around it. Plain and simple, we have a system of apartheid, which is upholding our society, upholding our food system. And what we should be concerned about is when we talk about the legacy of slavery, the fact that we continue to see in our food system, in our farm system, in our temporary foreign worker programs, where the SOP seasoned agricultural worker program. Let me flag for a second. Am I going too fast for peeps or no? I'm okay? Okay, I just want to make sure because I do talk a mile a minute.
Christopher, no, your audio is perfect and you're
okay.
Yes.
Beautiful. So basically, every facet of understanding of the dehumanization continues not just simply from the existence of programs like this and the way it is, but how we basically perceive the role of Black and Brown workers. The program denies them the ability to live as equals. It dehumanizes people. Occupational segregation continues, where Black and Brown workers are literally segregated from the communities today. Our legal system is a different legal odyssey where workers are because of their tied work permits. People come to Canada on these tied work permits. They have no access to residency and must return home. So people continue to be disciplined. And so when we talk about the logic of plantations and very much what happened in the Caribbean or the Deep South continues in our agricultural system through these tied permits. So the continuing competition, the racial subjugation, both within the workplace and through our legal systems, but also the idea of what our food system is. You're going to hear the employers and the government talk about our so-called food sovereignty, the wanting, the yearning, the desire to feed ourselves. But in reality, migrant farm workers are fueling and building an export-oriented system.
Sorry, Christopher, yes. My apologies. Just if we got a request from the interpreters, if you could just speak a bit slower, that would be great. Thank you very much.
In a nutshell, the exploitation that farm workers are coming to be employed under is to fuel an industrial farm system, which is main driver is profit and export to other countries. So it's really, none of this, what I'm saying is new. At this point in time, with all the media work that's been done by many amazing people, lots of awesome people have been taking this incredible issue on. Many of you are doing the advocacy for this. But then for some reason, there's been no shift in 55, 60 years. So this is not simply about an EDI objective. This is not simply about thinking about diversity or making a more robust multiculturalism system. This is straight up white supremacy. This is straight up racism. And it's basically containing, controlling a group of people as unfree labor. Now, you mentioned resistance. And I think when we're talking about exploitation, it's paramount that we think about what resistance is. And workers, right from when I started, to people who I've never met before I arrived on the scene, have found it different ways, everyday forms of resistance, working slower, fighting back, leaving farms, talking to one another about the different forms of injustices from their bosses, helping each other through situations of pesticides and chemicals. The everyday resistance is really important. And as allies in the struggle, the work that many of us are doing right now, where we're trying to chip away at this entire system through fighting for the rights of injured workers. And I know IAVGO people are here, and they had an important legal decision. The recent class action lawsuit that was launched looking at the theft by the Canadian state of migrant farm workers' wages, or the EI deductions, I should say. The fight against racism in the fields and the recent DNA victory. So legally, there's work going on. Community people are showing up to support, but it's a paramount of what farm workers are doing every day through Wildcats, through saying no, by making the ultimate sacrifice of making sure that other workers can work safely. That's what we should be inspired about. And for me, that's what moves and why this work continues after all these years. Thanks.
Ooh, Chris, thank you for opening us in such a beautiful way, especially with highlighting, one, the role dehumanization is playing in allowing these programs to continue. Because again, as you talk about in this article, as you just talked about, when we look to the past, it's very easy to see, oh, that was wrong to do that. And when we have a deeper understanding of that past, we're able to look at what's happening now with a more informed lens, particularly when we think to the future, particularly when we think to how our actions and inactions are informing the future in a way where they will be looking back at our actions and action and having an opinion about it. Now, and now I'm interested too, Chris.
Okay, we're good. Thanks a lot. Okay. Hey, it's David Lepofsky. I'm on now. Sorry about that.
Hi, David. If you could please mute yourself, I'll come to your point next. I just want to wrap up with Chris. So Chris, this program and its legacy is all of our problem. And so I'm wondering what we can learn from its harm when creating policies and other interventions for Ontario labor markets and workplaces. So really, what can we learn from this program, especially if we aren't working in these spaces? What can we still take away from for our workplaces, for our interventions in the labor market?
I think, and this is the old comment, and all of us know this, right? We may have the best of intentions, but our impact could be more harmful. Our current discourse around international students with respect to housing and basically, making everything more difficult for people to live. The attacks, as of today, once again, on Mexicans and Central Americans, without looking at the correlation of what UMSA or NAFTA has done to destroy the Mexican economy, it should create pauses for us. And what I'm going to talk about is we may think that abolishing workers' ability to work in Canada is the answer. We're doing a so-called pause with international students with this idea that somehow we're going to get rid of precarious work or precarious workers by ending their ability to work here. My point is this is not about the abolition or ending people's ability to work. It's about ensuring that workers have full protections, both as with full status, the ability to move and stay, ensuring that people have collective power. And what's really driving from my perspective is that we've got an extremely powerful corporate lobby. Government listens to corporate power. They don't necessarily listen to us. And it's about trying to challenge this corporate power with respect to agriculture. Agriculture should not be seen as an exceptional industry, meaning that workers should have equal access to overtime pay, to holiday pay, to all the benefits and protections that all of us have. Agricultural workers continue not to have these things. Work is still going to be deadly and dangerous until we take the conditions to regulate and to protect and ensure workers can exert their rights. And it's not about us looking paternalistically on workers coming to work as so-called unskilled labor, right? And the idea of unskilled labor has multiple racial dimensions for us to also unpack and to address. Workers want to work with dignity. They want to work with respect. People are proud to be farm workers. And they take pride in knowing those crops and knowing the ability when to pick, right? And looking at this beautiful harvest. But they don't want to be working when subjected to pesticides or fear of wage theft or fear of being sent home for doing the right thing. So it's about ensuring workers have dignity, full protection of our legal systems, and a system to protect precarious workers from reprisals. And the overall idea about permanent status, which I think we need to unpack what that means. Some people get uncomfortable, like, oh God, these Caribbean people want to come live here. Oh no, God, they don't do their time. this is stupidness. This is nonsense, right? All these people have been coming to Canada for decades. And we have to remember, before the arrival of the Caribbean and then Mexican workers, that the Dutch, the Polish, and the English farm workers came as equals. It's only when we started bringing Black workers first from Jamaica then elsewhere is when we changed our laws. So people should not be contained, controlled. We shouldn't be subjected to racial divisions in the workplaces. Immigration laws should not be used to divide workers. And workers should have the ability to collectively organize and demand dignity from a multi-billion-dollar industry. Oh, sorry, yes, exactly, colonialism. This is part of a colonial project. This is an ongoing colonial project. I do not believe in post-colonial stuff. I believe that there's a continuation of ongoing colonial legacy and a colonial project in our relationship to the global South. And it's important to look at what's happening right now through that lens.
Woo, thank you, Chris. You were practical, you were on the point, and you were on time. You are such a gift to have here, and I really want to extend my appreciation for bringing our conversation to where it needed to go. So thank you. I'll now transition to David. Welcome, David.
Hi, can you hear me now? Believe it or not, Zoom broke accessibility, and when that button comes up that says, "Do you consent to being recorded?" I couldn't find it. I literally had to call my university to get them to activate it for me.
I am so sorry, but I'm so happy you're here. It is such a gift to have you here as well. I've used your research and your work plenty of times in the past, especially around your work in advocacy in disabilities. And so I really want to speak particularly to your role as chair of the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, so AOTA Alliance, and particularly the employment standards. And so I'll drop a link to the chat for anyone who may not be as familiar with them. But David, I would love to hear from you in terms of if you could provide a bit of a brief background of what they are to anyone who may not know. And then if you could provide kind of 3 highlights of what the standards have achieved or haven't achieved.
Okay, sure. So in a nutshell, the problem we face is that the world is designed and operated overwhelmingly on the implicit but unintended assumption that it's only for people without disabilities, whether it's the buildings where we go in, the transit we ride, or the places where we work. They're full of disability barriers, not because anybody wants it that way. There's no conspiracy against us, but they wouldn't look any different if there was a conspiracy against us. The intent or lack of intent doesn't matter. The result is a disaster. Who does it hurt? It hurts everyone who wants a job, everyone who has a job, everyone with a disability, and everyone who's bound to get a disability, because we are the minority of everyone. Everybody either has a disability now or gets one later. Well, the old way of solving this was first try to educate the public. We tried, didn't do much. Then we tried to ban employment and other kinds of disability discrimination. We fought for those protections, won them 42 years ago. They're helpful, but they require you to fight workplace barriers one at a time. And most people with disabilities just don't have the resources, the time, the capacity to do that. So that led us to fight for an Accessibility Act, the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. The idea would be the government would pass detailed regulations that would tear down the barriers we face so that we don't have to litigate them one at a time, and also regulations that would provide directions to employers or other obligated organizations so they'd know what they'd have to do. Great idea. Happy to have led the campaign to get that passed. We were excited when it was passed, but the government's implementation of it's been a flop. In 2011, they passed an employment accessibility standard, which is a great idea, but it doesn't tell employers what barriers to remove and prevent. It just tries to essentially provide procedural supports for the duty to individually accommodate individual employees. In other words, keep your old barriers, keep creating new ones, but if an employee with a disability needs accommodation, here's how to smooth that process. Now, it's good to smooth that process, but the reality is that It's not making the changes in the workplaces we need. The workplace of today looks dramatically different than it did 5 or 10 years ago. Where we work, how we work, the equipment we use to work with. The same will be the case in 5 years. If employers set about now to ensure that the workplace of 5 years from now would be dramatically different, would be an accessible one, we'd get there, and we'd get there, I think, easily. Just for one example, the digital equipment we're going to use, it not only hasn't been bought yet, it hasn't been invented yet. If we make sure it's accessible, that would change things dramatically. So let me wrap up with this. What do we do? Well, we need to press the provincial government to enact a strong employment accessibility standard, but we also need a strong education accessibility standard to tear down the barriers in the workplace. Because if you can't get a good education, you can't get a good job. The AODA Alliance is leading the campaign on these, and in the materials that are being circulated for you, you can sign up to get our email updates, aodaalliance.org, aodaalliance.org. If you go to that website right now, click on the sign up link, paste in your email address, you'll get action tips. But the second thing, and let me wrap up with this, the second thing that's really important.
Sorry, could you just speak slower? Just for
Oh, I'm sorry. Absolutely. The second thing I want to conclude with is, listen, disability is an intersectional ground. Disproportionately, Indigenous people have disabilities. Disproportionately, racialized folks have disabilities, because disability is correlative with poverty. And disproportionately racialized folks and disproportionately Indigenous peoples have had far more than their fair share of poverty. So acting on disability acts on racialized equality and Indigenous equality and so on. We've got a good potential to make that happen, but it's not being done right too often. And a recommendation I'm going to give you. The good potential is in the increased focus on equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's great we've got it and we need more, but too often it's not including disability. And if we want to make sure we protect everybody, we need to expand EDI to include the word accessibility. If you flip the letters around, you get inclusion, diversity, equality, equity, and accessibility, IDEA, which would be a very good idea. EDI is supposed to tear down hierarchies, but if we don't include disability on a footing equality, we don't tear down hierarchies, we just create new ones, and people with disabilities are at the bottom. So there's a way we could improve things, harnessing EDI by adding accessibility and ensuring that in all places where EDI is practiced, accessibility is a full and equal partner in it. Thanks so much. And again, sorry about the tech delay.
No worries. Thank you so much. And for highlighting that piece on intersectionality. And it's interesting, at this summit, we're going to be seeing a presentation and discussion on COC's new research project on employment barriers experienced by Indigenous people and peoples of color in Ontario. So like this disaggregated data, it becomes incredibly important when we start talking about and thinking about disabilities and understanding too how our other identity markers and experiences shape how we experience disability and access to those accommodations and supports. And so, David, I kind of want to follow up in terms of practically how we're seeing, because you touched on intersectionality, which was kind of where I wanted to go with the conversation. Have you seen a really great case study, maybe even about of a workplace that's implementing or honoring these standards in a way that is intersectional? So I'm just thinking.
We're not in a position, we're a grassroots volunteer coalition. We respond to the kind of crisis of the moment and media call of the day, and obviously the government initiative that we've got to respond to, and the feedback that we regularly get from our many supporters. And so I can't say I've seen one, but it's quite possible there is one that I simply just, hasn't been brought to our attention. So I'm not saying it doesn't exist. But here's the thing, the employment accessibility standard as written will not achieve the promised full accessibility in employment by 2025 or even ever. Even if it was fully implemented, even if it was fully enforced, and neither of those is happening, because it doesn't tell employers who want to do the right thing what they need to do. So it requires each employer to reinvent the accessibility wheel and possibly get it wrong or not even bother. So the formula of the Disabilities Act of having effective, strong accessibility standards that let them know what they need to do, that set deadlines and that's enforced for those who don't, it's the right formula. It's just that we've had government after government flop in implementing it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
And the effect is, so let me just make it clear. If we do something like EDI and focus as we should and must on racialized folks, people and on Indigenous people, but we don't include disability, then the benefits of EDI will disproportionately, I should say, flow to racialized people who have no disability and Indigenous people who have no disability. And I don't know anybody in any equality seeking group who wants that result. Of course they don't. Of course they don't. So it's yet another illustration of an unintended result, but one that we need to worry about. Mm-hmm. And the other thing we need to worry about are when we see organizations that say they're and proudly say that they're promoting equity, diversity, and inclusion, and commendably that they're trying to, but when they only focus on two of the equality-seeking bases, but not the third, then there's the risk that they will be complacent, thinking, hey, we're doing great. So for example, York University, I'm not picking on them because they're worse, I'm going to pick on them because they're an illustration. They did a major consultation, I volunteered to take part in it, on a draft EDI policy. And it looked like it was all about race and indigeneity, but didn't include disability till the last minute, sort of added in a few little lip service token things that were grossly inadequate. But at the same time as they were doing that, they dissolved Enable York, which was their center that was aiming at, it wasn't their center for accommodating students with disabilities, but it was supposed to be the center of an organizational basis for advocating for inclusion across the York community. So they're promoting EDI at the same time as they're dissolving Enable York. Now, I haven't been there for a few months, so I can't tell you where they're at now, but it's just an illustration of the kind of risks of complacency when disability is not a full partner, and the way that it can hurt all equality-seeking groups, especially those who are disproportionately included among people with disabilities.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I really appreciate, David, how you underscored the difference between an intent and impact, where yes, we can intend to not be ableist, but that doesn't take away our responsibility to the impact that we have ableist harm. And I can definitely attest to that in my own personal journey, especially in recognizing, for example, working at the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate, where we were doing incredible DEI work. But when it came down to honoring my medical accommodations, that was a very long, difficult, and problematic road that ended up pushing me out of that space. And so I really appreciate you underscoring the importance of bringing that lens of disability to when we talk about DEI, anti-racism, these kind of interventions. So thank you, David. And I'm actually going to start transitioning to hearing from Brian.
Well, thank you much. And I apologize to everybody that have to go. I'd love to hear the rest of it, but I'm jammed today with 3 different talks and so on. So I've got to roll. But thank you all for including me, and best of luck.
Thank you, David. Now, Bryden, I want to stay on this lens of intersectionality and kind of flip the conversation, because I also find that in many disability spaces, we fail to acknowledge racial disparities and how race, age, gender, sexuality, really does inform our experience of disability as well, and can actually create a lot of barriers when navigating disability advocacy in workplaces. And it was really interesting too, as David was talking about there being just a complete flop on AODA standards. And from what I've been able to find just on all of the documents and background research, no steps have been taken for implementing the first review of these employment standards by the Ontario government. And so we really are seeing this kind of failure of standards and theory to practice in the workplaces, especially. And another place that we're seeing this devastating flop is in the TRC calls to action, where as of 2023, as per Yellowhead Institute calls to action accountability, a 2023 status update on reconciliation, 0 of the TRC calls to action have been successfully fulfilled. And this is extremely concerning. So when we're looking at employment standards, AODA employment standards, when we're looking at TRC calls to action, when we're looking at these frameworks, we're seeing neither of them are being implemented, but also we're seeing very little collaboration between these two kind of frameworks, where the TRC calls to action were created for that purpose, to inform these kinds of standards, to inform this kind of work. And especially, I think this is really important to bring up with just COC Indigenous Solidarity Statement, where we're talking about the TRC calls to action. Yet we're continuously failing to align our efforts in any field, because it's all relevant, with these calls to action. And as David was saying, this is incredibly important when we look at unemployment rates, when we look at disability rates in specifically Ontario for Indigenous peoples. For example, the overall proportion of Indigenous peoples in Ontario living off reserve who report any kind of disability, 24.9%, is greater than the proportion of non-Indigenous people who report disabilities, 15.2%. So as much as we need to talk about all these aspects of diversity and inclusion, yes, disability needs to be at that intersection. We need to talk about that intersection. But what this is also highlighting is how incredibly important the TRC calls to action really are. A knowledge of them, an understanding of how they apply to our work and sectors and expertise. And if we're going to be coming into these spaces, naming the leadership roles that we have a responsibility to those. And so, Bryden, I want to really explore this issue. And you do incredible work, particularly as your role in Indigenous Justice Program Coordinator for the Sudbury Community Legal Clinic. And the question that I would like to open up with you is, what harm have you observed by not engaging with Indigenous and Northern communities? And you can speak to TRC calls to action, but don't feel the need to go into too much educating for anyone in the room, as that is our responsibility. It's everyone's responsibility to understand these. But really, again, what harm are you observing by not engaging Indigenous and Northern communities when creating labor standards, policies, or programming?
So when a lot of programs, policies are developed, a lot of considerations are forgotten for Northern Ontario Indigenous folks, as well as non-Indigenous rural people, and it's the vast area that Northern Ontario covers. I couldn't pull it up, but there was a clinic report for the North that said that there was like you could fit 75 Torontos in the area that Northern Ontario covers, but we don't receive that funding to address any of the issues. So the geography and the isolation impacts Indigenous community disproportionately, but non-Indigenous rural communities are also impacted by these geographical locations and the lack of access to transportation, technology gaps. There's no cell service in some areas. And some folks have also done research into the digital divide that impacts First Nation communities. Even though there are mining camps, logging camps right next to many First Nation places and lands, and they have full access to technology, the technology doesn't reach the First Nations. Only the corporations are interested in resource extraction. And so that really leaves the Northern voice out of it unless you're bringing yourself to work for those companies. And even then, it's you got to go to work for 12 hours a day, go underground, blow up some rocks, and then go home. And that doesn't sound like any life to me. But what the Northern legal clinics wanted to do was they designed this study. It started, the design was started before I started here in this clinic. So I just sort of managed the project at a time when the director was here that was working with that project. It's almost finished, and I'm not really sure what the name is, but as they were working through it, it was called the Northern Community Legal Clinics Indigenous Legal Needs Assessment. It really needed a better name, and there could have been a better vision for the research, but I'm glad for the data that did come out because the consultants did some great work. And I'm hoping that we can use that to create a more strategic approach to meeting the unmet legal needs of Indigenous communities in the North. But it's also important to note that community legal clinics only focus on specific areas of law, and that they mainly revolve around social benefit tribunals and landlord tenant board stuff. And we could possibly take on a case-by-case basis different family or criminal law issues, but unfortunately due to capacity limitations in all Northern legal clinics, that would just push people beyond, they're already pushed too far to do what they do.
Thank you, Bryden, and thank you for highlighting too the kind of specific areas that you work in and the law that your clinic focuses on. But in reviewing the report, there were definitely some very transferable insights to the workplace and to the labor market, particularly from the engagement report, where there were these kind of highlights on the wise practices for engaging in community, in research, and understanding kind of how to establish, to build more ethical, just relationships that will lead to outcomes, data insights that can actually lead to addressing the root causes of why we're doing this work in the first place. So drawing from that report, can you share 3 practical insights from the wise practices section of that report?
Yeah, sure. I think the ones that are the most important to me, and the ones that will also involve developing a shift for the culture, because in the clinic system, that's also what the report is calling for, is there's a deep shift in culture that needs to happen in Northern legal clinics. I'm only going to speak for Northern legal clinics because I've only ever worked with Northern legal clinics. And yes, there is a deep need for a shift in culture. And so that involves also the workplace culture, the hours. So the one section of the wise practices was flexibility. And that goes for our hours with meeting with clients, but also the flexibility for people to come in and out of work. Yesterday, the weather up here was crazy. It was 2 degrees in the morning, and then by 4 o'clock, it was -12, probably even more with the wind chill. I decided just to stay home because I take the bus and I didn't want to stand around in that. But those extremes in weather and climate impact everyone here in the North, and they impact everybody in different ways. So we need to, in legal clinics, develop some flexibility because lots of people work either in mining or logging, and those are long hours, and they can't visit us between 9 to 5. Another wise practice section that we're going to develop is developing more accessible and welcoming spaces for legal clinics, because legal clinics are so clinical. People don't always want to come in and share their experiences, which are often very traumatic experiences and impacting their way of being and their livelihood. And so we need to have these flexible, accessible, welcoming spaces for our clients, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. So in Sudbury, there's some of my activist friends work on trying to get the city to do better on clearing the sidewalks, because there are a lot of folks that use wheelchairs up here. And it's really challenging to get around in an electric wheelchair in the cold, but also when it's icy. So those are some of the things that legal clinics can look at that are within their power. Unfortunately, the scope and mandate, as I mentioned before, for legal clinics is very, very narrow, but the report also calls for maybe expanding that a little more, if we can, with increased knowledge capacities, of course. So another third part of the WISE practice that I think is really important for Northern legal clinics and other agencies as well as collaborative interagency service development. So when I first came here, people, a lot of the staff had their own resources, and they knew where people could go to get food, clothes, or shelter, that kind of thing. But I think in our community, especially, it needs to be developed in a more cohesive way and more collaborative way. So we're not stepping on anybody's toes and there isn't a duplication of services, because then when you duplicate services, that money gets cut. Oh yeah, so that's it for that part.
Thank you so much, Bryden. And I really appreciate every chance I've gotten to learn from you, even in this preparing process. I think my experience in working with Northern communities is that, like, you just learn so much from the people, the culture, like, there's so much innovation coming out of the North. And so often we get caught up in the South of, like, all our policies, all our programs, all our standards. And we kind of forget about the humanity and the spirit of why we're doing this work and what it actually means on the ground. And so I really appreciate you bringing these insights and kind of to summarize for the rest of the audience how I see what Bryden just shared as very relevant for any kind of workplaces, responding to realities outside of your space. When we're working with DEI, when we're working with anti-racism, when we're working with shifting our organizational or institutional impact and culture, it's one thing to look internally at our policies, but then how are we responding to the realities outside of our institutional space? What are we responding to in terms of the journey that people go to get here, and then when they leave? And so it sounds like a lot of these kind of practices, those WISE practices are transferable anywhere. Making sure that we're collaborating and that we're navigating the competition that especially the nonprofit sector is structured to stoke, essentially. If we're duplicating services, we're competing for funding and are therefore less able to actually do those services well. And so kind of navigating that competition mindset and really identifying who can we partner with versus who do we need to have on our scan, our monitor, to see what we need to do to differentiate ourselves so we can get that funding. So Bryden, thank you so much. And I'm going to now transition to Sue-Lin. I'm really excited. Thank you. Yeah. I'm really excited, Sue-Lin, to hear from you, to have you wrap up our panel. You are just incredible. I've worked with so much of the products of your labor through my journey with anti-racism research and policy development. And I really respect particularly where you're able to do your work so successfully in academia, in policy and governance, in policing with the Toronto Police and RCMP. You go into these very often hostile spaces and are able to come out the other end with having honored community insights, perspectives, and needs. And you are very effective at doing that. And so for your contributions, I really would like to look at the work that you did in leading the development of the Ontario Anti-Racism Data Standards. And I'll drop it in the chat for anyone who's not familiar with these standards. But my question is, because you've worked again in a lot of, I will call them hostile spaces. You don't have to comment on that. But what were the most impeding tensions that you've navigated in implementing particularly data collection in these institutions and particularly these standards.
Thanks so much, Larissa. And I'm just so happy to be a part of this this panel that you're moderating. I'm fangirling as well so much for everything that you bring to the table continuously and for constantly showing up and speaking your piece and just, I think, allowing others to be able to shine as a result of just you being you and bringing that into the space. So I just want to thank you for that so much. I also want to very much start off by acknowledging the key role and partnership of the Color of Poverty in advocating for data collection. I think from the time that I've started on this journey quite some time ago, and I'll just name some key projects, for example, the Black Experience Project and the partnership there, to even advocating to the province in the first place to collect race and identity-based data. Color of Poverty, you've been there lockstep. And so I just want to thank you and definitely appreciate the opportunity to talk about the work here today. So tensions, where do I start? So I think one of the things in terms of the anti-racism data standards in particular, it was a policy framework that, that was also very aspirational, a bit technical as well. But at the same time, I think we, the team and I that were there, didn't quite understand the implementation aspect of it. And so going to the Toronto Police to now take this framework to then implement was a very different story with regards to, well, how do we build community trust? Particularly around data. How do we shift our policies and our communications? Where is the education and training coming from as well? And so when we talk about some tensions and gaps, I would say that the data standard being as comprehensive as it was, didn't come with those implementation tools necessarily in order for organizations to really take that up in a way that would be, I think, quicker based on what the community's expectations were. And so those are some of the tensions we came up with, where the community was saying, you already have the data standards, go, go, go. Whereas, we're inside Toronto Police and, for example, even in RCMP differently, but where we still had to develop the policies. We still had to look at data management and governance. Even the very systems in which police collect data is for policing, is for investigative purposes. It's not for the purpose of addressing systemic racism. So we even had to work with system vendors around making the system able to collect, analyze, and the data in a way that's meaningful, addresses our objectives, but also manages the privacy concerns that community has, that's also in the data standards, to make sure that the data is being used to advance racial equity, to mitigate and eliminate barriers, and not to further stigmatize communities. So there's nuances even within that. And then, some of the other tensions were just around folks within data management having an understanding of how data has been managed for policing for so long, to then now say, well, we're collecting it for this purpose. So there's a lot of training and a lot of education that had to happen, working with unions, for example, to get them at least understanding what it is that we're trying to do, working with internal members as well. There was, I would say, equal, in some ways, distrust with police as well as communities. Communities in some ways were saying, why are you collecting our data? Not everyone out there wanted us to collect the data either, for different reasons, even though for the purpose of addressing systemic racism, the lack of trust around, well, who has access to the data? How do we ensure that it's going to be used for our purposes for community and not co-opted in some other ways? And then police there were members within the police that were saying, how do we know that you're not going to use this data to then single us out as individual actors when you're trying to address systemic issues? So there were some of those sort of tensions. And then, some tensions around, well, should certain things like training around data collection be standardized from the province first, which hadn't happened with the delivery of the data standards. And so we had to do that for our agency, and then other agencies looked for that information, but there wasn't a way to standardize that at the time as well. And so there was and data literacy internally, explaining to people that data collection is for the purpose of addressing systemic racism. Some folks just didn't see how the two related. Some folks related, education and training with addressing systemic racism and not necessarily data collection. And so many tensions. There are more, but I think those are the ones that I just really wanted to highlight.
Yeah, thank you. And I definitely you're very it's very reminiscent of definitely many of the experiences I've had in race-based data collection. And I'm wondering, because I learned a lot about that process with regards to the workplace and even my personal leadership in the workplace and how I communicate these different kinds of interventions when we're collecting the data. Why are we collecting it? Why is it important that you understand how we're using it? How are we building trust so we can get to a point where we can have an open conversation where that data is actually reflective of who you are and what you experience? And so I'm wondering if you could identify kind of some of the exemplary wise practices or best practices that you've seen kind of to address and navigate those tensions that would be relevant for people as they're looking to kind of address different barriers in the workplaces or Ontario labor market.
Well, one, I would say getting leadership on board is so key. I can't stress that enough. Sometimes agencies, organizations, institutions will say, here's the money to do this. Here are the people who are going to do this, go off and do. And it's that's not it. Really, leadership stepping in, stepping up, handling some of the difficult conversations, mitigating the tensions, where they exist, but that is so key. But also making sure that leadership feels supported in their ability to make decisions was another key. So many times, you're playing implementation lead, but also coach. You're coaching leaders on what it is that they need to say, how it is that they need to show up in order to support this work meaningfully. I'd also say engaging community early and often. Engaging internal stakeholders early and often. And sometimes, those things are take up a lot of time, take up a lot of energy, but that is so important. If people are not brought along in the process, you're really going nowhere. And in particular communities, what I'd often hear is, well, there's so many communities. How do we tackle this? Who do we talk to first? But having folks that are really adept at community engagement, community development, and helping to build those practices is also just so important. And building partnerships. And so you're not just going out and having town halls where you're telling people or announcing what it is that you're doing and you're sort of listening at a one-time session, taking in the information. It's like, what are the partnerships that you're building to make sure that there's ongoing, consistent feedback, people are brought into the process, and that there's even opportunity for some co-decision making as well, which is so important and key. And understanding local context. And that's one of the things I learned working with the RCMP, for example. Even the ways in which we talk about data collection and anti-racism here isn't necessarily the same in the Yukon, for example, which is where I spent a lot of time as well, in BC, even in Nunavut. And so adapting to local context requires that you're definitely connecting with communities in a different and very, very meaningful way. Also train the trainers. And so both in the community and externally, one of the things we were able to do with Toronto Police in particular, we were able to provide stipends to community agencies to then host community engagement sessions with their clients, participants, as opposed to us going in there and doing that and so one, that's capacity building. Two, you're diffusing knowledge, but you're making people actually key partners. The other thing I really have to highlight is robust policy practice. And really, it's not just one policy. That's one of the things that folks were saying, well, you can develop a policy for data collection. There's so many intersecting policies that we also had to look at to make sure this policy would be as effective as we hoped it would be. We had to look at data collection, data management practices, around the organization in general. And so making sure that you're not just developing a policy, but you're using an equity lens to look at all the other intersecting policies that could impact the work that you're doing as well is very key. Of course, evaluation. You can't start work and then just do it and not, look at what you've done, looking at all of the stakeholders that were impacted by your actions as well. And then, of course, an action plan. And so, with some of the gaps, which I know we'll get into, developing an action plan is so key and important because it's not just about collecting the data and looking at the data and talking to people about the data. It's, what are you going to do with your findings? How are you going to utilize that data to mitigate harmful impacts of racism, systemic racism on communities? What does that look like? And how are you holding yourself accountable is really also an important part of the key. The other thing is, I would say, transparency, and not just transparency with the process, but transparency with as many products as you can. So transparency with the policies, transparency in communications, transparency around who's even involved in the projects, at what levels. That's also so key and important. Communities are more so wanting to know who are the people behind the work. And so finding ways so that people have that understanding on an ongoing basis.
Thank you so much, Sulin, for really wrapping us up in a very practical way. Audience members, I hope you were taking notes. That was essentially a masterclass. All panelists have really shared the most practical ways that we can leave this opening plenary, enter the summit in a very action-oriented way. And that's what we really wanted to do today with this group of people, is identify and inspire and give guidance to really ensuring that the conversations that we're having throughout today lead to meaningful impact and action. And Bryden, Chris, David, Sulin have done an incredible job at really identifying some really practical ways to do so. And so with that, if we could actually have everyone use anyone who's on the call, use the little reactions in Zoom or drop in the chat just a thank you to the panelists. I know we're in a virtual space to just experience some kind of humanity. If you can share kind of any feedback you have or support you have for the panelists in the chat or using the reactions, that would be just greatly appreciated. And with that, I'll wrap up this opening plenary. Thank you so much. I really appreciated being here and continuing to learn from all of you.
Thank you so much to all of you for that incredible session. It got me fired up. I also want to admit that I am very into watching bad television. I'm right there with you, Chris. And so I think what's really reflective in this panel for me is we say intersectionality a lot, but our panelists showed us how it lives and how it breathes in all of their work and the meshing. And we really need to think about all of the frameworks, the research, and all of the things that our panelists talked about and what we can do with those pieces of work and what's not being done. So we have had a pretty tremendous morning, but I do think we need to take a break. It's 11:24 already. And so if I can invite everyone to just take a break, do what you need to do, and to come back to us at 11:40 in about 15 minutes, and we will see you then. Thank you.
Hello, Leslie Wu. I am here to support you with the audio test.
I'm just trying to see if she's here. Leslie, are you here?
In the meantime, Namrata, is the break ends at 11:40?
11:40, yes.
Okay. I'm just gonna put it in the chat for anyone who had to step away for a minute or so, and they'll know.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Leslie Wu, in case you're here, my name is Adil. I'm here to support with the audio
Yeah,
channels.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. That's great.
Sorry, I was just fussing around with my speaker, but hopefully you can hear me okay.
I can hear you, but I just need to check with if any of our interpreters present. Can you just give me a thumbs up to know that you are present? We just need you for 1 second to, okay, I see a thumbs up. Perfect. Leslie, I just need you to please count till 10, and that will help the interpreters to know if the audio is working properly on your side.
Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Okay, perfect. I'm getting messages saying that all is good with your audio. Thank you so much, Leslie.
Thank you.
We will be back. Is there anything else you'd like?
No, I'm good.
Good.
Just tell me when you need me.
Okay, we're taking a break right now. We
Mhm.
will all be back at 11:40.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for our interpreters. There's no testing further. We will all be back at 11:40.
Welcome back, everybody. I hope people had a chance to take a good break.
Hi,
Just-
Shalini.
We'll just give people a moment to gather back. Okay. And I will start our recording again. Just want to check in. Bill, are we good to go?
May not be back yet.
Sorry, can you please repeat that?
Are we good to start our recording again? And do we have all our interpreters back with us?
Yes, we are good to go. We count to 3 and start the recording. 1, 2, 3.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for continuing to join us. And we've had a really great opening from our elder and our Indigenous Solidarity Statement from Leonie, a pretty incredible opening keynote around employment equity and what it truly, truly means. And then a really, I think, invigorating and very thought-provoking sort of panel on mobilizing for racial equity. So part of why we wanted to bring everyone together today from Color of Poverty, Color of Change is also around some of the work doing over the past year or so in looking in particular at labor market inequality and racial justice in Ontario. And to that end, we will be launching a final report on the information we were able to obtain through a survey. So both quantitative, but also very qualitative information from survey participants. And so we'd like to take the time that we have remaining before lunch to invite a panel that will be led by Namrata Tolagani, and she will be introducing our fellow panelists who actually are going to give us some responses and their own thoughts to the report. So I'm going to pass it over now to Namrata.
Thank you so much, Shalini. I really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. My name is Namrata. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to be presenting the research summary report, and then I will be introducing 3 respondents to respond to the report. Emmanuel Melez, Leslie Wu, and Nancy Mitchell. So I will introduce them each in turn after I have presented the report. Awesome. And if it's possible to stop the slide deck, that would be wonderful. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, and let me know if I'm going too fast at any point. So I wanted to give some context. My name is Namrata. I've been working with Color of Poverty, Color of Change on a labor market discrimination study. And the idea for the project was actually written pre-COVID, so we had to pivot a little bit. And I'm coming to you from the unceded and unsurrendered Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. It's currently very sunny here and still very cold, but sunny, so that's giving me some hope today. And I also wanted to acknowledge that through the work that we've been doing, we had over 30 community partners for this project and 8 focus groups, which community partners led. It was an incredible effort. And I just wanted to say that to acknowledge that none of the work that we're doing is done in a silo. And it is really through a lot of the relationships that we've built over the years, and also through all the work that focus group participants, they've contributed their emotional labor, their stories of discrimination, as well as the community partners. I just wanted to acknowledge that. And if I am going too fast, just let me know to slow down, and I will be happy to do that. So I'm just gonna take you through, oh, and before I continue, I'll just also give you a visual description of myself. I'm a brown femme. I have long, not really long, like shoulder length black hair, wearing glasses and a Palestinian keffiyeh, and I have headphones on. Okay, so in terms of the labor market, there is a body of evidence that suggests that the Canadian labor market is highly color-coded. And what that means is that it produces disproportionate and persistent systemic discriminations, barriers, and inequities for both Indigenous and racialized communities. So Color of Poverty, Color of Change commissioned a mixed method study in Ontario. So we had both an online survey and focus groups to add to this growing body of evidence. So the goal of the study was not just to investigate labor market discriminations and inequities that racialized workers face. That was one of the goals, but it was also to document how they are impacted by and respond to these discriminations and inequities. So crucially, we wanted to understand how labor market discriminations and inequities affect civic participation for racialized workers and how we can deepen that civic participation. So in line with community-based research, we did ask study participants to recommend program and service needs and policy change recommendations. So I'll just give you a high-level overview of the demographics of the study and then take you through the key findings. So our survey had, we had 189 participants. A lot of cisgender women filled out the survey, approximately 70%, and people born outside of Canada made up about 65%. In terms of the survey, half of the respondents indicated their racial identity as Asian, so 25% East Asian and 22% South Asian, and 5% Arab or West Asian. And 1 in 5 respondents identified as Black, with 9.7% identifying as Black African, and 9.7% identifying as Black Caribbean. So while the survey was implemented in 10 regions across Ontario, the highest regions that we got respondents from were Toronto and Quinte region. So because we had a higher, like disproportionate levels of respondents filling out the survey, what we decided to do was prioritize some key underrepresented groups in our focus groups. So we had 4 focus groups with Black community members, 2 with Tamil community members, and 2 with community members from Arab and West Asian backgrounds. So I also wanted to touch on one thing before I tell you the key findings, was that one of the goals of this project was also to document labor market discriminations faced by Indigenous peoples to better understand how they experience discrimination and how that varies from racialized communities. However, due to both logistical barriers and other barriers, we were able to only recruit 12 Indigenous participants for our survey. And so I wanted to highlight that as a limitation. And our plans to do focus groups didn't materialize. And I think it's really important to think about our role in that process. And so we have done reflection as a committee on that. And because we have some data from the survey in regards to Indigenous participants, we are thinking through and reflecting on and how we can utilize that data. And we do plan to follow up and support other labor market discrimination studies, but just recognizing that we won't be the ones leading it. So I think that's really important to note. I'm going to take you through some of our key findings. So unsurprisingly, a very high proportionate of racialized workers in Ontario. So folks who identify as Indigenous and Black, and folks who also identify as being two-spirit, transgender, and gender diverse, and people in the 2S LGBTQIA community report that they've experienced discrimination or unjust treatment. So that is unsurprising. However, I wanted to let you know that the key reasons for workplace discrimination or unjust treatment vary within and between racialized groups, especially as most people have said that the reason that they perceive that they are discriminated against is because of their ethnicity or racial background. So because we have disaggregated data, I can walk you through it. So the top reason for workplace discrimination or unjust treatment that Black Caribbean respondents reported was racial background. For Black African respondents, the top reason was ethnic background, followed by accent and Canadian job experience. The top reason for workplace discrimination or unjust treatment for South Asians was ethnic background, while for East Asians, it was accent, and ethnicity was the top reason for workplace discrimination or unjust treatment for Indigenous people. So qualitative data, so from the focus groups and the open-ended responses in our survey, talk a lot about the direct forms of racism that participants experience. So in particular, focus group participants from the Black focus groups, and then also the Arab and West Asian focus groups, were more likely to share experiences of direct forms of racism that they had experienced in their workplace or their community. And I would like to highlight that many of the experiences of racism that they shared had very distinct anti-Black and Islamophobic orientation, and in some cases, they were directed at them by non-white people. So I'm going to read two quotes to you from the focus groups. So there is one thing that is there with racism among minorities, because once brown people get into a particular job, and I've seen it on more than one occasion, where they will find all excuses not to move you on. I've had a personal experience where I was supervising a few of these people, and it was the most uncomfortable thing for them. There was even one who said that he was a supervisor. This young man had the audacity to go to a big conference and say, I report to that person because it cannot be seen that he reports to a person like me. And that's a participant from an Afro-Caribbean focus group in Durham. And I'm going to highlight one more quote that a participant from the Arabic focus group in Peel Region said around religious discrimination. So some people looked me up and down because I was wearing a hijab, which made me hesitate. Many of my friends were denied opportunities because they wore hijabs. This thing affects me a lot, especially religiously, because I don't want to take it off. I've seen many instances where my friends have faced racism because they wore hijabs. This thing affects me, preventing me from following my religion's regulations. So a lot of the racism and discrimination that people have been talking about points to systemic discrimination, but a lot of the times participants found it hard to actually pinpoint what they were experiencing. We wanted to note that as well. Okay, I'm gonna go on to the key findings because I'm running out of time already. So another key finding that we found was that while racialized workers have very strong aspirations in terms of career and decent, meaningful work, a high proportion of racialized workers in Ontario are stuck in precarious employment, marked by non-permanent and or part-time jobs with low wages and limited benefits. So 36% of our survey respondents reported having no extended healthcare benefits, 38% reported having no paid sick days, and 27% indicated no paid vacation. Almost half of our respondents were low income and reported their household income before tax to be $50,000 or less. So focus group findings indicate that racialized workers have very clear views and knowledge about what decent work and healthy, inclusive workplaces should entail. Like they know it. Like they were able, when we were analyzing the data, it was so easy to see that they had all of these amazing ideas on what decent work means to them, and they were able to imagine and picture that and communicate that. So I think that's really important to note, but it's just that the cycle of precarious work and low wage work and limited security and multiple jobs keeps them from being able to access that. And often when participants did share about their precarious employment conditions, they also provided lengthy accounts of all the steps they had taken to continue to take on decent work in their field, such as applying for hundreds of jobs, taking job search training, recertification, downgrading, doing volunteer work and unpaid internships, networking, and more. So you can really start to see like the systemic barriers that are happening as a result of this. Something else that we found is that the non-recognition of international credentials is very high cost and onerous, and it creates a double set of systemic barriers that are pushing immigrants from racialized backgrounds into precarious job pathways. So the first layer of systemic barrier is experienced when their international credentials and experience are not recognized by their professional regulatory body, let's say, and by potential employers. So for example, a lot of the times just because they're non-Western universities, that is like the reason, and it's not necessarily due to the standard of the education. So the second level of the barrier that they experience is that they're a lot of the times racialized workers are pressed to pursue recertification and retraining that are often very costly, onerous, and time consuming. And the lack of affordable post-secondary education combined with the lack of on-job training. Just lost my process. And the high cost of living are intersecting root causes for the second layer of systemic barriers. In terms of the last key findings, we also found that systemic barriers to decent work can push racialized workers, especially those who are recent immigrants, to take on irregular jobs that make them more vulnerable to exploitation and workplace industries. So in our focus group, some immigrant participants shared how systemic barriers in getting decent work in their field force them to take irregular jobs. So under the table cash jobs, and specifically, they mentioned this in the initial years that they've come to Canada. So I'm gonna read a quote. I told the owner of the business who was from our community, and we were from the same city back home. But they didn't care and would cheat us just because we have restrictions such as education or income. Not only did the owner not help me get out, they kept on picking on me, and one day they made me so nervous that I didn't pay attention and my finger went under the sewing machine, and the owner begged me not to tell anyone about it. So I didn't go to a hospital or tell anyone, and then my hand became infected. It's from a Farsi speaking focus group in Toronto. And then when we're thinking about these experiences of discrimination, something that we were really interested in is how this experience damages people's workplace well-being and also how it damages their overall health. So among the respondents that filled out our survey, over half of So among the respondents who filled out our survey, over half, so 55%, reported that this experience of discrimination had a major effect on them, and about 30% indicated a moderate effect. And so what are the consequences of this when we're thinking about it? Okay, so many participants, about 3 in 5 participants who experienced workplace discrimination felt that they did not belong at work. Around half felt fearful to speak up at work, and 45% indicated that it made it difficult to focus on their job. So when we're thinking about this in the context of employees doing well, just these impacts alone is like enough for people to not feel safe at work, to not be able to feel like they can contribute in their workplace. And it's quite alarming. Furthermore, there was also an impact on trust levels. So in terms of, sorry, I'm just losing my train of thought, but in terms of the experience of discrimination, over half of, about 44% of the respondents said that it actually made it difficult to trust their coworkers once they experienced this discrimination, and 43% said it was difficult to trust their supervisor. So it's like, imagine not being able to also trust the people that you work with, right? That's like a domino effect. And then when we're looking at mental health, approximately half of the survey respondents indicated that their mental health was negatively impacted by this discrimination or unjust treatment. So I think it's even though we talk about the impact of discrimination, we know that it has an impact on us physically. Racism is not just something that you experience, it's like an actual like physical, it has like a biophysical effect. So I think that's really highlighted in these findings. And so I'm going to say that we do have a couple of more findings, but I'm just going to skip to the last one just because I've noticed that we're almost out of time. In terms of community and civic participation, many of the respondents in our survey reported low levels of participation in community, as well as in social and volunteer events, mainly due to the lack of time and motivation. And even the civic participation strategies that racialized communities took part in are really shaped by the types of discrimination that they experience, but it's very specific to the community. So among the participants who shared about civic engagement and collective action, there were some interesting variations by group. For example, Black participants mentioned that experiences of systemic discrimination tend and/or inspire them to engage in anti-racism and anti-Black racism work at an individual level. For example, they started to mentor Black youth on their own and or at the collective level. So for example, joining Black parents associations in their local schools or working with teachers to deliver anti-racism and Black History Month related programs. Focus group participants that were from Arab or West Asian backgrounds tended to advocate for more programs and services that are culturally and religiously responsive to people from those backgrounds. So for example, participants from the Arab or West Asian focus groups expressed concerns about discrimination and unfair treatment, including by the Canadian government. So for example, having a lower level of support for Palestinian refugees compared to Ukrainian refugees. And a lot of them mentioned that they made a really concentrated effort to participate in solidarity demonstrations and events related to Palestinian, Syrian, Sudanese, and other Arab communities. So I'm just highlighting a quote that a participant said. I participate in anything related to Arab countries like Palestine, Syria, or Sudan. I participate in anything related to this, and also I demonstrate. This is a participant from an Arabic speaking focus group in Peel region. And then participants in the Tamil speaking focus group, specifically those who've been in Canada for a long time, they emphasize that having elected officials from their own background has made it easier to voice community and specific needs and concerns directly to their government. So this is reflective of the growing number of elected officials at municipal, provincial, and federal levels from a Tamil background. So I didn't have time to actually get to our recommendations, but I hope that sharing the key findings has been illuminating. I think it's really important to think about the ways in which data disaggregation can really help to bring a lot of these things to light, because I think not having that it can be really harmful. But I'm going to actually leave it to the respondents to kind of respond and to kind of envision how we can use some of these findings to be able to mobilize for change. And what does it mean when you have data like this? So I'm gonna actually welcome up Emmanuel Mellis, and I can give a bit of an introduction, who's the founding executive director of the Network for the Advancement of Black Communities and the principal of Aman Consulting. He is a visionary and formerly a United Way Toronto senior management team. He's led innovative leadership and capacity building programs. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Namrata. I know time might not be on our side to be able to cover recommendations. I'm hoping the course of the respondents' input will highlight some of that. I want, first of all, to congratulate Color of Poverty and Color of Change, staying power in our communities for the longest of times, holding really not only the hope, the energy, but also the commitment to rally support for change in our province. I have been here since the morning keynote and following the discussion in the panels and the chat. It's been incredibly inspiring, and a lot of discussion that's focused on solutions. And so I am joining you here from Toronto, Treaty 13. And I wanted to start by my remarks by also taking a moment to pose as a person of African descent here in the city where we live in Toronto, the impact of the African refugee crisis in people of African descent and others. And also recognize just last week we had a second loss of life, unfortunately, of an African refugee trying to seek services in the current situation that we have, where a lot of our brothers and sisters have ended up in the streets, and there have been a lot of reaction in terms of community mobilization and support to try to create conditions for change around this issue. Everything is interrelated. I think a lot of the recommendations in this study affirm what we have been knowing for a long time, that indigenous and racialized communities in this province have been in the periphery of this province when it comes to employment equity. But also employment doesn't stand in isolation. And the determinants of employment are so much related to the social determinants of health. So in my remarks, what I wanted to highlight is some of the things that the study has shown and the recommendations. For example, the whole recommendation about strengthening the work of the Anti-Racism Directorate in the Ontario government. I come from a place where I'm looking at this from what is that we can do, what's within our locus of control. We know the data has been telling us in many different ways that we have a lot of work to do. So the question for me is like, who has the locus of control on the change that needs to happen? What's our role as community leaders and advocates? In what ways can we start shifting the relationship that we have with governments and others that influence the change? And as Professor Blackett, showed in her remarks earlier this morning, when it comes to employment equity, despite the amazing work that the task force that she led has been doing and some incremental progress federally, this issue is essentially a provincial issue. And so when we look at the levers of change, I go back to the Ontario government and look at the recent anti-racism strategy that has been reviewed. And Sulene spoke about the standards, for example. The standards that we have in the anti-racism strategy, they look at child welfare, they look at justice and education, but they're not sufficient. I mean, there are a number of issues and concerns around the collection of disaggregated data. And, during COVID, we had a health equity, Black health equity panel of leaders that have made recommendations of inclusion of health equity data, for example, in the collection of data. So we need, I think that recommendation that you have about strengthening the anti-racism directorate is right on the mark. But how do we create a community accountability to that? Again, I go back to some of the comments that Sulin made about, meaningful and early engagement with community. Some of the comments earlier on made in the panels about data and measures, in terms of tracking. So one of the things that I'm hoping coming out of the summit is Color of Poverty and Color of Change is such a diverse platform that brings different voices. Maybe there's an intention, what was said earlier on by the prof around, a deliberate intention and action in terms of moving forward. And so my hope is that coming out of this study, coming out of this summit, we will collectively work together to sit with the Ontario government, the Ontario Anti-Racism Directorate, and have a discussion of consequence around the standards. In what ways can we actually improve on the standards? I shared in the chat, the most recent, report of the anti-racism directorate in terms of the progress against the strategy. We have worked closely with the directorate. In 2020, we have organized the conference on combating anti-Black racism. Another lever that we have at the moment, is the extension of the 10-year anti-Black racism plan in the city of Toronto. That's a lever that we can use in terms of engaging communities to really advance the work around equity, if you want. The other important thing is around civic participation. And I wanted to put the spotlight on us at the moment, on us as the nonprofit charitable sector here in Ontario. For those that are not aware, this sector is significant. It almost employs, almost 1 million people, a little bit less. It's 70% and more is women. It employs a lot of our racialized folks. And when you look at the role of this sector and its contribution to the province's GDP, almost 8%, it's a significant player in itself. So the question becomes, are we leading by example ourselves? Are we complicit to precarity in the province? The study talks about the challenges of precarity, how, we're hiring people part-time, not giving them decent wages and access to benefits, And so I think here we have, under our locus of control, the ability to change the discourse and engagement with government. Because when you look at the funding in the province, almost anywhere between 30 to 46% of the funding for the sector comes from government. How are we actually advocating for funding reforms? How are we rejecting precarity? If we don't demand and be accountable ourselves as leaders, leading organizations, we will have to offer staff, meaningful opportunities for job, including, as I said, benefits and decent wages. It's then difficult to advocate for change, When it comes to Black communities, as you know, there's a significant component of the public sector that's Black, that is, experiencing a lot of inequity within the public service itself. There's at the federal level, there's a Black action lawsuit against the federal government. The Human Rights Commission themselves has been accused of being, racist and treating its own employees with exclusion. So there's a lot of work to be done. But I think by starting to recognize the progress that's the incremental progress that's happening federally and provincial, building the blocks, I think addressing intersectionality is critically important. In Black communities, you know, one of your study revelations is that Black is not homogeneous. The experience of Afro-Caribbeans is different from African Canadians. We have not even extended the discussion at the national level, which is the experience of our Afro-Nova Scotian brothers and sisters different. So recognizing the diversity within the Black family is very important. And so my call in terms of leadership for all of us, including leaders within the Black community and the organization that I'm part of, is to really, it's enough about talking intersectionality. We need to actually create intersectional spaces of leadership, intersectional space of system leadership, where we come together and try to advocate with government and among ourselves and others about the changes that we see. We cannot improve civic participation if we're running precarious organizations. Our folks are working 2-3 jobs to make ends meet. So I'm not surprised about the findings there. The key question becomes, how do we actually work at the government level in terms of funding reforms so that, you know, we're paying people decent jobs? What instruments we have at our disposal? There's no point of having an anti-racism directorate and talking about standards if we're not engaging them and calling to task the things that need to happen. And we need to be able, beyond just working, organizing events and conferences with them, we need to go beyond that and say, like, sit at the table and figure out how do we change. The last comment that I would bring here is, and this was also brought up in Professor Blackett's point about the international dimension to this. Yes, 2024 marks the end of the decade of people of African descent. Now, here in Canada, the Prime Minister extended it to 2028. But internationally, we have this permanent forum for people of African descent, similar to the UNDRIP. There is an opportunity here to use the framework of justice, development, and recognition, and figuring out how do we actually overlay these in the work that we could do in terms of advocating. So connect the dots, you know, look at the levers that you have, and don't shy away from having difficult and necessary conversations, first and foremost among ourselves, because we are a significant sector, and then across that discussion with governments. Those are the remarks that I am offering, and thank you again for inviting me to this amazing summit. Thank you.
Thank you, Aman, for your comments. They were incredible, and I feel like I need to process all of them and listen to them again. You know what I mean? But absolutely, in terms of the intersectional spaces, there needs to be that. And your question is a really great one about what are we actually going to do beyond this summit? How are we actually going to do this and mobilize and be in those spaces? You know, it has to go beyond the research report. It was really powerful. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce Leslie Wu, who is a city leader with 25 plus years of experience in sustainable community building and urban development, primarily in the GTA. Leslie is currently the CEO of Civic Action and has been since 2020, and spearheads coalitions to drive transformative urban action. I'm not going to read her entire bio because there is so much I could say, but welcome, Leslie.
Thanks so much, and humbled to be here. Really, thank you for wanting to hear what I have to think and say on the important research that that you've undertaken. So just firstly to introduce myself, to say I am from Trinidad, the land of the creolized and assimilated Carib and Arawak peoples, an island that was settled and colonized by the French, the Spanish, and the British, all of whom displanted and enslaved people of African descent. And here as an immigrant in Canada, now living on these Treaty 13 lands. I wanted to start off by sort of giving a little bit of the point of view from which I am coming, so that my comments sort of so it's an understanding of where the lens through which I sort of reviewed the report and the findings. I think most of my career has been in public sector and private sector, and only more recently in the not-for-profit sector. And a lot of my work as an urban planner and a policymaker has revolved around some sort of very large macro scale step change initiatives at a scale and usually at a systemic level. And so I say this because one of the things I want to the comments I want to provide are more along the lines of Aman's question around where are the levers of change and who has the locus of control, and how can this data reach what I would call the ears of those who may not normally want to listen. In my experience, step changes can happen. They're episodic, they don't happen all the time. But there are a couple things that I've observed in working at the scale of the Greater Toronto Hamilton area, the Greater Golden Horseshoe, and my experience is around things like infrastructure or land use planning and development, is that where you see step changes are around, one, a common belief in the fact base that is presented. So this is a commentary about the fact that we have so many facts, and that the trying to find and quote unquote fake news, and discerning as any audience or individual or organization about what is truth and what are the hard facts, and given that, where do I and how do I react or respond to it. We live in an environment where there are many sources of information, many truths being found, and all being questioned or not questioned. So the first comment is around, I think, wherever possible, and I think the report, the draft that I saw alludes to the fact that a lot of the research that has come out of the survey and the focus groups reinforce information that has already been out there for quite some time, or even more recently. And I think that's an important thing to understand. And it's not only research that's come out from the not-for-profit sector, it's research that has come out from the public sector and even from the private sector. And so it's important to find a way to have almost a coalition of this information that is as diverse as possible in terms of its sources, to reinforce the truths that lie within the information that's here. On one hand, I don't like to say this, but there weren't any rapid surprises in the information, sadly. I think what's even more discouraging is that this is information that we've known in some way, shape, or form for quite some time, and the fact that we are unable to accelerate progress is one of the things I think we need to really tackle. Why? Why is it? Before we get to the how to a certain degree. I think the second piece that I've observed in terms of where step change and mobilization at all levels can happen, not just in the not-for-profit sector, but in the private and public sector, is around political and corporate mobilization. And it can happen. I've seen it happen, but it takes a different kind of coalition building that is a lot of hard work. And it takes, to a certain degree, respected leadership and trusted leadership, which right now the data shows is very slim and much eroded from where we've been in some points in history. So, making sure, one, that the data reaches the ears and eyes and minds of not only those who are impacted by the findings, but those who can lever their positions of power to make change happen. And then I think the third thing I want to point to is a more difficult thing, which is the system that we're existing in, which is a capitalist system, a colonial system, has not yet figured out how to measure the value of civil society in the not-for-profit sector and the value of all the things that we've been talking about today. I haven't been here since first thing this morning, but I did arrive mid-morning, and we have not, or maybe I shouldn't say we. I think there is yet to be a better way of figuring out the metrics that aren't balance sheet metrics. I know in the private sector there are efforts, and even these are getting pushback around ESGs and how to measure the value of what social justice and fairness bring to a society to make it more livable and more prosperous for everyone, not just a few. And so I think there is work to be done to better calibrate, or I don't even know, calibrate is the wrong word, raise the ability, and it's to a certain degree, it may be a technical ability for when corporations or even government who very much depend on certainty and they want to see, I can't tell you how many times when we talk to corporations about, the importance of collaboration and why leadership is important, they ask, well, what are the metrics? How do I see the impact? And we don't always have the right way of measuring because it is medium to long-term impact that we're talking about. And the short-term metrics are generally measurements of symptoms, not root cause. And so I think one of the things that the research, I hope, can enable us to do is sort of, go the next step to kind of say, okay, given all of this, what is it that we aren't measuring that we should? How can we bring into the tent a range of expertise from different sectors to shape that in a more collaborative way? You can tell from now, I'm a very practical person, and I really interested in seeing how we make stepwise changes, not just by ourselves as the not-for-profit sector, but bringing those who are, it's much more difficult, those who are a bit more behind. But I have a belief, because I've witnessed it, that cooperation can happen with the right settings, with the right mindset, and with the right leaders. Just in 2 points in closing, because of the work that we do, and because part of this survey spoke to the state and the impact on civic engagement, our mission is around the importance of civic engagement to build a more livable and inclusive city region. The data around, so not this data, sorry, the recent data that the Toronto Community Foundation did on social capital, which is pointing to the decline in 25% decrease in volunteerism in the city of Toronto between 2018 and 2022, twice a twice amount declined it's higher in the decline for women. And the fact that there's a huge loss of hours that this whole city and region was supported by is discouraging. Also, the fact that the level of trust that we have seen in the past is deteriorating for institutions. I think most people know that. But what's more concerning is how the trust, when parsed out by demographics, the degrees of failed trust are around ethnicity and race. And so this data makes us, I know at our organization, more committed to the importance of a robust, well-equipped, and informed pipeline of rising leaders able to take places, not just in the not-for-profit sector, but in the private sector and in the public sector. Because without that, the change that we need, that we're all talking about that we need, I have to believe, and I am hopeful, it will come with that transformation, and we can see it happening. And we're all very impatient because many people here on this call have been around this blocks, for decades. And my view is that on one hand, the research is sort of doesn't show us a trend in a direction that we'd all like to see, but I am hopeful that actually there are solutions, not hopeful. I know there are solutions, and much of it lies in my belief in our ability to find the individuals and the champions within the range of sectors that we're talking about, and support them, open the doors for them, connect them in a way that is enabling. So hopefully I didn't stand too much on a soapbox, but thank you very much for asking me. I'm very, very humbled to be asked my opinion on this.
Thank you so much, Leslie. I feel like both with Aman and your commentary, I'm just like blown away, and I was like taking notes during the whole time. But I do think it's important to ask that question about progress, and accelerating progress despite having the data. Why aren't we seeing change? And I think that's a really important thing to interrogate. And echoing Aman's points as well about where those levers of change are and who is the locus of control, I think really being able to mobilize. And I think having what we're hoping for or one of my visions for this project was actually having kind of a community of practice where we're able to have these sorts of things and continue to have these discussions, because we have so much data, and I feel like everybody is doing things in their own silos. So if we're able to come together and mobilize, I think that would also be helpful. But I'm so grateful to have you with us. Thank you for your commentary. And I'm going to introduce last but not least, an incredible speaker. So happy to have you with us. Nancy Mitchell is the Director of Consulting at the Diversity Institute and holds a master's degree in political science with a specialization in women and gender studies from the University of Toronto. She has experience as a consultant for UN Women and has contributed to various initiatives, including ending violence against women and women's economic empowerment. There's so much in your bio, Nancy, and I'm so thrilled to have you join us. Welcome.
Amazing. Thanks so much. You can hear me okay? Yeah, okay. Great. So thanks so much for having me. Like Leslie said, I'm super humbled to be here as well. Before I share some of my thoughts, and I'll try to be brief because I know we're trying to get into a Q&A as well, but I do want to acknowledge that I'm coming to you virtually, but from Toronto, which is the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat people. So Treaty 13, and of course, home to many diverse Indigenous, Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people. So I had a chance to read the report, and I found that all of the findings were really important, and they, of course, like the other panelists said, have levers for change baked into them. My comments today will speak primarily to the experiences of the Black community, as that's my lived experience. And much of the work that I do really focuses on labor market outcomes, opportunities and levers for change that exist across businesses, the private sector, et cetera. So that's kind of the lens that I hope to bring to the discussion today. And I have three overarching findings. And the first one I want to start with is that I think it's so important for us to recognize that the findings that exist in this report are not mutually exclusive. They actually reinforce one another and paint a kind of cyclical picture. And so what I mean by that is we see that the report mentioned the devaluation of skills for racialized and immigrant individuals, where their skills, their expertise, and their knowledge isn't valued or is seen as lesser than, particularly when we're thinking about international or what people typically call foreign credentials. So we see a devaluation of skills, and as a result, we see that racialized and immigrant individuals are being pushed into precarious work, unstable work with low pay, little benefits, and often having to work multiple jobs. So you see that there's a direct line between this skills devaluation and ultimately the precarious work. And this, of course, to me links to the finding that the report also showed, where racialized and immigrant individuals are perhaps having lower participation in community or civic or advocacy actions. Because realistically, if you work multiple jobs, when are you finding the time to actually go out and engage in your community, advocate for the community, et cetera? And of course, we know that strong communities also are a real contributing factor to advocacy. And so here you're seeing that cyclical process where one issue leads to another. And so whenever we're addressing issues, I think it's so important to not think of them as siloed boxes, but instead as something that's mutually important and mutually reinforcing. Similarly, I'll also say that the report had a lot of data on discrimination. And so we're seeing that even when racialized people enter the workforce, they're discriminated against. And so, of course, if I'm experiencing high levels of discrimination at my workforce, I'm not inclined to stick around. And that then reinforces the precarious nature of work. It impacts retention. And then we see the cycle beginning. We also see people turning to different methods of work or entrepreneurship, given the experiences that they're having at their workplace. So in sum, a cyclical nature and self-reinforcing that I think is really important. Something else I wanted to highlight, and it wasn't particularly brought out in the report, but I wanted to bring in some of the data from the report into some of the information that I'm seeing on my end, is really what I'll call the leaky pipeline. And this is where we see a lot of Black individuals in the workforce at an entry level, but then their representation dwindles as they go up what I'll call the corporate pipeline into management and leadership roles, and ultimately into positions where they're at that C-suite role and they're making decisions. And I wanted to couple that with some of the discrimination data that we've seen from the report, in that I think those two really paint a fuller picture. If I or another individual, Black individual, racialized individual, am experiencing discrimination at the same rates as what's seen in the report, I think it was something like 76.6% of Black individuals were saying they were experiencing discrimination. I'm not inclined to stick around. And as a result, this may be coloring in some of the lines of why we're seeing that leaky pipeline, why we're seeing that we have so many individuals at the entry level, but fewer and fewer at the executive level. And a similar experience that many Black women have, which is the glass cliff, where we're brought into these positions of leadership, which are undersupported, underfunded, understaffed, and ultimately set up to fail, and thus we leave. So ultimately wanted to show that the research that has come out of Colors of Poverty related to discrimination colors in some of the lines of why we're seeing such high levels at the entry level and not higher up. And then the last thing I wanted to say, and it's ultimately, I find that a lot of these conversations speak to the individual level. So we say skills devaluation and discrimination and the undervaluing of racialized and Black individuals impacts people, right? They impact me as an individual, my family, how I feel about myself, my self-esteem, my physical health, and my mental health. But I think it's really important for businesses. So I want to actually speak to the businesses on the line too, if there are any. I think it's important for businesses to understand that this has a negative impact on you. This impacts the talent pools that you're accessing. Over half of the population in Toronto is racialized. And if you're discriminating at the very basic level of recruitment against racialized individuals, you're actually not accessing a really diverse and well-rounded and expert level of talent that you could be accessing. You're missing out. If you have discrimination baked into your workplace cultures and environments where, and we saw through the data, that people are afraid to share their opinion, where they feel undervalued, where they feel like they don't belong. If that's what your workplace looks like, people are leaving. People are not sticking around, and that's impacting your retention rates, your productivity levels, whether people are bringing their full and authentic self to your workplace. You can think about your decision-making tables and whether or not they're diverse, or whether it's kind of the same people saying the same thing, finding the same solution to the same problem. If you have diverse people with different backgrounds and lived experiences around this decision-making table, you're better equipped to find new solutions to your common problems. And so ultimately what I'm saying is that these issues that we saw in the report, they impact individuals and they impact families. But if you're a business, it's really important that you care about this from a human rights perspective, from the perspective that discrimination is, of course, against the law, but you're also losing out when you're not supporting racialized, immigrant, Black communities, Indigenous communities, et cetera. And that's a really specific call that I want to make to the businesses on the line. So I'll wrap up so we can get to the Q&A, but ultimately I wanted to hit home that all of the different findings in the report are not mutually exclusive. They really reinforce one another. They color in some of the lines or some of the information that we see broadly in the ecosystem about gaps at the leadership level. And then ultimately, businesses stand to lose out too if you have issues with workplace inclusion, recruitment and retention, and you're ultimately succumbing to many of the negative things that we saw in the report. So I hope that answers some of your questions, and thanks so much for having me here.
Thank you so much, Nancy. I feel like, yeah, there's so much to learn, and I feel like I really appreciate you connecting all of those things to say it doesn't just exist at an individual level. Here are all the ways that all of these things intersect. And it is definitely a trend for years where Black and racialized workers will enter a workplace and then not be supported. They won't be given promotions, all of these things, and then you'll look at leadership, and they're not in the middle and higher levels of leadership. So I really appreciate those points, and specifically about the leaky pipeline as well, and the glass cliff, and how Black women are disproportionately affected by this. So I really appreciate your comments on everything. Thank you for being here. Okay, so we'll do a very quick Q&A. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. I can also field it to the panel. And if not, we will break for lunch. So I'll give folks a minute if you wanted to gather your thoughts. Okay. Everyone's just processing how amazing research is, maybe. I don't know.
I don't see any hands up or questions in the chat.
No.
And I think it's been a pretty intense morning. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank you, Namrata, for starting us off with a presentation of some of the key findings, and to thank Amin and Leslie and Nancy for those really critical comments. And I just want to say that in reading some of the raw data and the qualitative information provided by people who participated, the comments were heartbreaking. And many of them are things that I see every day in my legal clinic work, and that often a lot of us hear and have experienced actually ourselves. And so I just want to reconfirm for everybody that the full report is going to be launched, I believe, on March 21st, and to look out for that. And in your evaluations, any comments that you have on things we could have done better, because I do find data collection very difficult, and learnings or things that we should be thinking about would be much appreciated. And so at this time, we are at the point where we can take a break for lunch. And I see that it's 12:45. We had scheduled a 1-hour lunch for everybody, and I would like to honor that 1-hour lunch. So if I could ask everybody to be back for 1:45, and in the afternoon session, we will not be actually spending as much time talking at you, but we want to take the opportunity to break out into rooms and to talk to each other and to gain each other's perspectives. So we hope that you will come back to us at 1:45. I will give you a little direction on the breakouts, and then we will be able to spend a little bit more intimate time, as much as that can happen in a Zoom virtual setting, as we can with each other, and talk about some really critical things on community benefits, on employment standards and the floor, and on the mobilization of employment equity. So I will see everybody back in 1 hour at 1:45. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. For everyone watching us through the YouTube live broadcast, we will be pausing on the live stream for now until after the breakout room session is over. So see you soon.